I wondered if, Mike Goss, I wonder if one of the issues that we need to take up over manure is that so much of it is applied as liquid manure, not as farmyard manure. I think a lot of the things that David talked about and others have really been concentrated on, you know, a technology of 100 years ago, and it's just not there. So I'm not sure that there isn't something that we can do in terms of changing the technology for managing manure so that we can make better use of it. I just don't think that it's a very efficient. It's very efficient in terms of dealing with a waste material, but it's very, very inefficient when it comes to building soil.
Since I retired, I chair the certification body for compost and for biofertilizer. And one of the, in biofertilizer in particular, linked to the retail sector, there has been a doubling in certified biofertilizer production plants in England in this last year, and in Scotland it's growing at quite a pace. Wales less so, but I think they are looking for quality outputs, markets, and they are so controlled in terms of vet regs and whatever that it is a quality product. So I think that there is likely to be an increased supply of both slurry-based and solid-based, anaerobic digestate, but for other reasons we call it biofertilizer. So I think there is going to be a larger supply, and it's going not to require, as much of the early work did, enormous miles to get it to site. So these are spread out across the country. And I think if the growth we saw at a meeting last week continues, it will be a significant source of quality material to add to soils.
Hiya. So I'm Emma Burett from Lancaster University. I've heard a lot about adding product like manure and things like that to the soil, but going back to the point there, that to me sounds a lot like moving one thing from another, which wasn't it. So it's not going back to what we're actually addressing here, which is emissions. And so trying to take things from the air and putting that into the soil. Now, the only thing that I know that does that would be plants. And so, and through the plants, the roots, because the roots and the microbes are the things that can contribute most to soil carbon. So because a lot of the conversation is going around about manure and adding manure, I'm wondering, how can we use plants? I mean, we've already said that when you change peatland to forest, that's not beneficial. So is there any sort of work done on which plants are best in which areas and trying to use the root systems to increase carbon, which I would argue may be most beneficial?
Can I comment on that?
Please.
I mean, your points are absolutely right. I mean, I think the exception, as I said, if there are, I think, some organic wastes, in inverted commas, that are currently either burned or go into landfill at the moment. If you can get them into some form and use them on soil, that is carbon that would otherwise go into the atmosphere that you hold in soil. So that's one smallish, but I think significant exception. And I completely agree with you with roots. I mean, roots are extremely important way of putting carbon into soil. And indeed, where people have found that experiments with adding straw have been a bit disappointing, the increase of carbon is quite small. I think this is probably because a lot of carbon is going in through the roots anyway, and the straw is a relatively small extra. But I think, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. You know, the scope for crop breeding and all sorts to look at roots. And I also think there is scope for intercropping, where you've got rows of one type of plant. If you've got bare soil in between, growing something else in between. And I've done some work with Simit in sub-Saharan Africa. And there, well, it's very common anyway, that where you've got maize rows that are normally 50 centimetres apart, to have some legume plant growing in between for all sorts of reasons. As well as fixing nitrogen and giving another product for the farmer, it does put more carbon into the soil through the roots. And I wonder whether even in our farming systems it would be good to look at a bit more of that sort of thing.
Can I just add to that? Just on the same question, that there is a very nice paper published a couple of years before, Soil Biology and Biochemistry by Daniel Haas, asking the question, soil carbon is mostly root carbon.
Yeah, that's right.
Just to follow up on David's comments there, and something that Claire mentioned, you mentioned agroforestry, which is quite widely practiced in France. Not very widely practiced in the UK. And there's definitely potential for us to look at how we can use agroforestry on our arable lands to actually increase this litter production both above and below ground.
Absolutely, and it has many other advantages. Erosion, for example, biodiversity.
Just quickly want to add cover crops.
Cover crops, intercropping cover
Herbal
crops.
lays, that's another one. These are research projects I know that are ongoing at the moment.
Yeah.
So we've got a project looking at the potential for agroforestry to actually contribute to carbon sequestration, if anyone's interested in that.
Paul Neil Price from ADAS here. I agree roots are the way to go. Coming back to the organic manures, just to finish that one off, we've got about 90 million tonnes of livestock manures. By comparison with compost, it's about 2 million, increasing to about 4 million tonnes. So it's limited in terms of how much green compost we can squeeze out of towns and cities. On the digestate, yes, that's increasing 4 or 5 million tonnes. I mean, the good news there's more of it. And as a whole digestate, it's a great nitrogen fertiliser, so that might add to help increase carbon stocks in certain situations. The bad news is the liquid digestate, there's no evidence that actually increases carbon. The separated fibre digestate might have a role, but then that has to be processed, has to be separated to fibre and maybe composted to improve it. So all in all, yeah, the manures have a great role locally increasing. They're a big hit in terms of increasing carbon locally on a field scale, but not on a national scale. But other things like cover cropping, no-till, intercropping can be useful, but a small effect.
Yeah. A small effect, but large surface areas. Yeah. And it goes with changes in cropping practices in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Chris McCloskey from Cranfield University. So at the Rothamsted SOM Symposium a couple of months ago, there's some interesting research from, it was either Australia or New Zealand, where they've managed to have quite a large one-off pulse of carbon into pasture land by digging up the pasture and actually turning it over. So they buried the plant at the top. I was just wondering if there's any potential for that to be of any use in the UK?
I heard that talk also, and I was a bit dubious. I mean, yes, it may be true that they turned the soil over, basically, to enormous depth. Isn't it? And so it may be true that by putting this organic matter that was near the surface at some great depth, a metre or half a metre or something, that it sort of makes it more stable. But I was very concerned that the disturbance that went with that was going to counteract it. So I was very suspicious of that. But, you know, we need to look at the data.
I think we should not be we should not be too carbon centric. That there are other consequences. Well, there's energy use to do that, and what about soil biodiversity? There's not only carbon in soils.
And I think for all of the experiments we have done in the laboratory, we try to manipulate the soil. We lose, at least we modify the soil and we lose carbon. So we don't need to have this experimentation.
I'd rather do zero till.
In that experiment, I think they also expose a lot of the recalcitrant organic matter at the topsoil, so that actually burn all that organic matter that was stored for a long time in the soil. So they had like balance effect from that.
Also, just to do the whole life cycle analysis, making sure, so moving slurry around the country, that it's 90% water. It's a lot of, greenhouse gases just there, in things like that, carbon that was well stored, and also the sheer energy of actually turning a soil over at that depth. We really have to be careful and do a whole systems approach to many of this. In my last plea in agroforestry, there was a bucket of work done 2 decades ago. We even had a national network of agroforestry experiments. Most of them have been dug up because actually the practicalities for many of our farmers, coming back to remember the poor souls who are doing this, just the fencing to actually protect the trees if you've got in pasture systems is not an insignificant job of work to do. So I would just encourage people to go back to some really fantastic work from 10, 20 years ago, and let's build on that rather than reinventing wheels and thinking about the practicalities of some of the farming systems. Not that we don't have to have a radical rethink, but let's just think about the machinery, the whole systems, use of fossil fuels and everything when we're doing this, so we don't get kind of perverse outcomes that we just of erosion in terms of flipping soil over. It just sounds like maize on erodible soils to me all over again.
Yeah, there's Jonathan Sandeman's work in Nature that shows that in some cases eroded topsoil to the base of some of our catinas can actually stabilise that carbon. But, that's a contentious issue. Actually, that's not what I wanted to pick the mic up for. And whirling of ideas, and I know that we've got more questions, but I just want to just bring us back, just finally perhaps onto this, David's point about the manure and some of these products that we're adding to the soil. I just want to give a couple of postcards perhaps from the past, because in a sense we've done this before. I mean, previous human civilizations have added their waste products almost out onto their own gardens, and that's what Joanna was talking about in terms of perhaps scaling back some of the additions we're making to agriculture. So we have those kind of Aztec communities, Maya communities, who used to add things from their back onto their back gardens, and we go to the soils now and we find 2 or 3 metre A horizons, which are still intact, and that happened here. I mean, Donald Davidson isn't here, but retired researcher now, and his work in the latter part of his years looked at UK practices, ancient UK practices, and adding mass to soils. Which brings me on to my final point to the panel, which is there's been a lot of talk about adding chemicals and adding liquids to soil, but that doesn't really solve the problem that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that we're actually losing soil in some parts of the country, filling the soils. I mean, Joanna mentioned earlier about 4permil, perhaps 4 millimetres. We're actually, on average, globally losing 4 millimetres a year of soil. So really, couldn't we perhaps unite the benefits of adding carbon to soil and organic products to soil, and also adding this solid mass, which you can't do with chemical liquid fertiliser?
I mean, David and I think Claire said it's not just adding carbon. It's not just the carbon you're adding to the soil. It's adding this fuel for the overall dynamism. And that, I mean, this is many of those soils that are eroded, particularly where there's maize, have just been battered. Whereas if you are supporting a living soil through adding carbon, that soil is likely to be much less vulnerable to erosion. And that's part, I mean, it's just adding the carbon is one part of the debate, but adding carbon as a fuel for driving the soil system is equally as important, probably more important, I think, for the long-term sustainability of all of our, for example, farming activities. And so that, I was in France last week and saw a field where they'd had maize, which I think was harvested in December. Not surprisingly,
wet year, isn't it?
I could have been a few, kilometres further north in the Somme, because that's what it looked like. But the road was also about 12 centimetres deep in sediment. Now, that's what we should... I still don't understand how we can allow that on sloping land, but we do. So, there are a number of things that are back to this matter of management and what we allow. And I still cannot understand how we allow winter harvesting of maize on sloping land.
And we give subsidies to grow the maize, to feed anaerobic digestate. It came out in the health inquiry, this is madness. If there's ever a role for national policy, it should be to say, not, okay, Soviet style, but there's some things you just do have to say, and public money to be used for that. Just madness, But it has been highlighted, that Rebecca Powell, who's on the Environment Committee, she raises that one as an issue. So I think that message has got through. It's just now trying to get it into the 25-year plan if we can get for England. It is absolutely named in the parliamentary inquiry, soil health inquiry. It's named as one of the things, together with burning for some of the things. So that's quite an interesting one. But there is some evidence of overly frequent burning is now perhaps causing us some of our problems in our peatland systems.
David? Can I just go back to the Paleolithic argument? There is no doubt that you can recycle your domestic waste onto your gardens, and there is no doubt that it was being done tens of thousands of years ago. It's not a very good model when you've got to feed 9 billion people, because you can't do it on a sufficiently large scale. It worked in the Paleolithic when the world's population was only a few 100,000 people, but it isn't going to work on a big enough scale to face the modern challenge.
Population was lower, but in actual kind of community density was actually larger in many of these areas. So a land per person, there was less of it. So there had to be, and obviously quite a lot of these places were suffering, especially in the Maya areas, were suffering from increased sea level. They had to build their soil, otherwise they'd be inundated with water. So not only was the soil made to increase or to do away with their waste and find a place for it, actually built them a home for them to live. Otherwise they would have drowned.
I'd just like to make a comment about potential of gardens. I mean, I agree it's not going to feed 9 million people on that side of things, but it's just kind of on a sort of tangential note. So I've been doing a lot of work with local authorities recently, and they tell me the biggest problem they have with managing surface water flooding is actually people paving over their gardens. So actually the cumulative act of individuals in very small areas does, in this case, cause a big problem. But then if you flip that the other way round, the cumulative act of people actually managing their soils in their garden could actually help to deliver some benefit, even if it's just mainly from an educational point of view and engaging people in those issues. And actually, on the flooding note, and we've not mentioned this at all, flooding is a big issue in the UK, but there are potential co-benefits from increasing organic matter content and actually reducing flood risk. By all the things we're talking about here in terms of building organic matter content, planting cover crops, all these things can actually help manage water, help keep it on land and help manage that risk as well. And if we're thinking about how we're going to finance this for farmers, there's this talk around payments for ecosystem services for flood risk management. And I think we need to bring these two, carbon and water, together better in a policy context to actually get those multiple wins.
So, and I think we need to be careful. Some numbers that have been put out for the flood mitigation risks are it's not going to save Boscastle, the next time round. So, but I do agree. It is risk reduction, and there's many co-benefits. But I do think there is no silver bullet. I think many of the options, from urban to trees to it's all, if there was one simple answer to this, we would have done it. And so all these bits add up. There's co-benefits and there's educational benefits and what have you. So I'm hoping no one's come here for the answer, because I don't think there is the answer. And many of these bits, even one of the languages we've got to be careful is about not saying, but that won't work, but that won't work, but that won't work. Because actually, that's kind of part of the problem with renewable energies, that none of them were going to be the next oil. And actually, that's why we didn't do anything in this country for years, because none of them was an immediate 20% hit. Whereas actually, if you do a bit of tidal, a bit of wind, a bit of that, you can actually add it up. And I think the same's with our soils. Some of it's the answer's trees, some of it's urban, some of it's gardens, some of it's peatlands, some of it's this. And if you put this all together, the co-benefits, we will, if nothing else, we're going to improve things.
Just a response to the point about Neolithic composting. Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't scale up, but one of the things I say to my students is that the flush toilet may have been a Victorian success, but it's a 21st century disaster. Maybe it's time for the Swedish-style compost toilets. I mean, if that were done globally, I mean, okay, we set it up with that system. It's going to be very difficult to change. But we are just flushing all of these nutrients straight into the sea and organic matter, which would combine very well with carbon-rich material.
One of the problems potentially with domestic disposal of that kind of waste would be disease control. I was also thinking about how subsidies within farming are quite a big component of driving policy. Is it worth considering doing that with household soils as well? For example, the back garden, paying people to not pay over the lawn.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, because we've actually had students do projects in gardens recently, because there's a lot of unregulated activities that happen in our own homes that actually can, so where we're located in Reading, we're obviously on a sort of peri-urban catchment, and the water companies have been doing engagement work with farmers, trying to get them to reduce metaldehyde risk. And one of the big things the farmers are coming back with, it's you're pointing the finger at us, but what about all those allotment owners, those gardens and all these other things? So we had some students actually go and ask people living in happy suburbia in Reading what they were doing in their gardens, and actually we tested some of their soils, and we found that their phosphate levels were about 5 times higher than they were on our own university farm, and that some people weren't applying any chemicals, but some people were applying metaldehyde once a week. You know, it's actually at levels that a farmer would never get away with. That, you know, in terms of public education, you know, you have to think that there's small areas, but the accumulation and action of a lot of people in small areas can have an impact, particularly in a sort of peri-urban environment. And then also there's a sense of equality as well, because we're talking a lot about asking farmers as a particular group to change their behaviour, and then we're not changing our behaviour ourselves. And actually, what the person running this water company project with the farmers found was that by being able to tell the farmers that University of Reading students were looking at what was going on in gardens, it actually made them feel a bit better about being asked to change their behaviour themselves, because they didn't feel the spotlight was totally on them. We have to think, you know, this is a sort of social thing. We have to all take responsibility for this. And no matter how small an area we own, we're all catchment managers, we're all soil managers to some degree. Even if we've just got a window box, there's something we can all do. And, you know, there's the leadership statement is you need to model the behaviour you want to see. And I think farmers are just like anybody else, and that they'll follow people who are actually authentic and actually modelling the behaviour that they are asking others to adopt.
You can measure soil carbon in soils as a result of land management change and land use change. And that message needs to be given to policymakers and farmers and other people who help farmers to measure soil organic matter.
Statement, but how do we do it? We keep saying we need to translate this information that we have to policymakers, but how do we do that?
I think we've already done it. We just need them to act. I think we don't need to be too defensive. You know, there's been a soil health inquiry. Various of us have been to the ministerial roundtables on improving soil. There's now there's loads of initiatives and industries actually now taking action themselves. We heard about the Crown Estate, National Trust. There's quite a lot of big ag firms now doing this themselves. We just need some action. And then the main request I hear from DEFRA is then how do you operationalise it? So the high-level regulatory framework. But just coming back to one of the points here, at what point do you give money incentive and at what point do you regulate against? And I think that's one of the really interesting things, because farming is an industry. So I think rather than linked to citizens, you know, why is farming industry different to other industries, if you like, which are heavily controlled in the emissions they can issue, and they have to show that they're monitoring the emissions that they do. Now, I sound very anti-farming, and I am not. I'm just thinking that, you know, the fact that a lot of farmers aren't even assessing their soil condition, so therefore carbon is being lost and things going. That's quite extraordinary when you compare to other industries and their requirement to actually monitor what they're doing. And going back to citizen, I have to pay for an MOT every year in my car. No one bribes me to do that. I pay for that to prove that my car isn't polluting the atmosphere. So there's quite a lot of complexity and equality between industries and between different things. And it's just something to think about. In terms of monitoring, I think the national government should take responsibility for checking on things like soil. But I also think farming as an industry should take responsibility, not be bribed to do it, for actually proving that they aren't damaging the environment that the rest of us live in, because 80% of soil degradation costs, according to the Graves et al. Paper, is experienced off-farm. That means we all experience it. Other people do. It's in the rivers, it's in the atmosphere. So, but I do think this is quite an interesting debate to have with governments about what is appropriate for an incentive and what actually should be a fine.
So I agree with you with farming being an industry, but one thing I'd sort of be wary of is othering farmers. As they cause pollution and we experience it. Farmers do also locally experience the impact of their own farming. So, for instance, the mud on the road, they're experiencing this as well. So it's just, I think They are a group of people, and I think sometimes when we get into a room as a group of environmental people, it's really easy to try to start bashing them like a minority group. It's just remembering that they are individuals as well. That was kind of probably my point there.
I don't know whether there's anybody from the NFU here, but one of the most contentious debates within the NFU is whether farming should be a profession with chartered status or professional standards. It's being portrayed in some circles as a licence to farm, and there's quite a lot of opposition to that from people who've been farming the same land for many generations. And the debate, if you want to polarise it, goes a bit like, how dare you tell me how to look after my land? That's an observation, but Bridget stepped into this area about whether it needs to be a regulated industry in the same way as others are. And I don't really have a strong opinion on that, because I don't think I know enough about the balancing arguments. And my second point is a plea, and it goes back to the observation that was made at the beginning there about us being able to measure soil carbon. Let's not get too worked up about how precise we need to be. A lot of the information is good enough, and it's good enough to take decisions. Sure, we can't get it to the second or third decimal place, but I don't care.
Yeah, can I add to that? Yeah, we know that certain land uses will send soil carbon or other properties in a certain direction. Yeah, we may not know the exact numbers, but we can say that's good practice and that's not so good practice. We don't have to measure exactly. I agree with that.
Claire?
Yeah, what I wanted, of course, it's an extremely important issue, and I think the community, soil science community, has really improved in its exchanges with stakeholders and regulatory people. I think one thing that is needed is incentives more than maybe regulation, and for that, as a scientific community, we have to work on benefits, because people do change their practices because they have benefits. So saying that you're degrading your soils, we're losing soils, that's not enough. And we have so many, as citizens, we all receive so many negative messages. Sometimes you feel like it's too much. What should I do? Stop using my car and stop not getting a bigger house, etc. So we need to have an assessment of benefits, and it's not just general language. Soil carbon is good. It's how much do I gain in terms of for example, irrigation, of what will be the benefit quantitatively for farmers, for different users. So I think we have to work on that, and have always think that there's no magic bullet, and to promote a systemic approach. I think we all discussed that.
And especially the farmer and what they should gain from that, not only for increasing yield, but in terms of money. I mean, what is the added value?
Time spent on this farm, days where you can use your tractor. Well, there are many criteria.
Farming is a regulated industry. It is also has its own crop assurance schemes, which are voluntary. I think there are some very good farmers out there who are doing very good work with soils. Farmers are focused on improving soil productivity. We are erring on a bias here in these discussions. We need to think about food sustainability and farming productivity as well. And I think we should also highlight the good in farming, because many of the headlines are headlines. They are grabbing your attention because of poor practice, and that is only a very small percentage of practice in UK agriculture. We have some of the best farming in Europe, in the world, actually practiced in the UK. We need more soil scientists on farm. You are looking at probably the biggest accumulation of them sitting in this small area of the room who are working with farmers on a day-to-day basis to try and improve soil productivity. We are doing some very good projects with AHDB, Great Soils, soil health projects. We are monitoring carbon levels on a daily basis, on an annual basis, in good, productive UK soils. So I just want to fly the flag and try and counterbalance some of the things that have been raised. I also work in the recycling industry, and I totted up in my head, I'm probably responsible for overseeing roughly 1 million, probably 750,000 tonnes of organic materials to land. And it is a bit of a fallacy in the UK that it's all being dumped in landfill. That isn't happening anymore. Landfills are closing very, very fast because our recycling rates are so good. So I just wanted to counteract some of the points that have been raised.
Can I just come in? Because I think it's really good points, and it worries me by us treating farmers as a like scientists. We're not all the same. Farmers are all the same, but there are some who are not doing the right thing, either because they haven't done the professional development. There's a plea in some of the colleges they're not learning about soils, and I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that by not, so in the soil health inquiry, it was raised that no one had lost their funding, their cross compliance because of soil degradation. Not a single one in the last 3-4 years. Yes. So for the farming industry, I'm actually trying to help by trying to say every farmer is great or all doing good. There's not. There's some fantastic ones. There's ones that are doing okay. And then there are a very small minority that I worry on behalf of the industry is really not helping the industry as a whole. And I don't know of any other industry or even as a citizen, whereas if you do something bad, you should at least lose the public subsidy that you're getting. So it's that element, and I'm sorry if it was the wrong way, but I do think we have to think about this element of either improved professional development. Go and listen to the NFU's statement to the public health inquiry that they didn't need to measure soils because they could just tell. They just knew whether their soil was in good condition or not because they could smell it. We have accredited labs. Let's use them and let's try and up the game of the farmers across the board, so that people do aspire to the best practices, and there are astonishingly good practices going on. But I do think where there is bad, we really should be able to admit that there is some bad practice going on, and the damage from that is very often felt, yes, on the roads, but it is off farm. So it's the trout fishery down the road. It's the local town that's experiencing it. So do you see where I'm going? I just think we need to be honest enough to say there is some bad practice, and just how do we deal with that, the small minority that it is? Does that make sense?
Sometimes it's down to economic pressure and bad weather. For instance, the maize harvest this year, it was just so wet. Farmers had to go out and harvest their crop. I know some of them, and they knew it was bad. They knew they were going to cause damage, but they felt stuck in the sense that there wasn't an alternative. And I think the thing that we also haven't mentioned today, and it's also another opportunity, is working with the supermarkets. Because farmers are getting public subsidies, but they're also suppliers, and what the conditions those suppliers place upon them and how that affects their decision making and their stocking densities. And I think that's something that is actually very real to a lot of our farmers, and it's something that we in the environmental sector aren't very aware of unless we're working directly with supermarkets, of which there's some really good examples of Waitrose. I know are doing lots of good work. I don't know if I can ask a question again, back to ADAS over there. Are you working with supermarkets at all?
Okay, I'm not ADAS.
Oh, sorry, apologies. I just saw Paul there, so yeah.
Yes, we are working with supermarkets. We're working with crop assurance schemes. I wasn't saying there isn't bad practice. Okay. That was not because I've done a couple of hundred farm visits in a single year. I know there is bad practice out there, and it is our job to work very hard to improve practices towards soils, and that's what we do. But what I was trying to say is that we need to acknowledge and encourage. Mm-hmm. And yes, there have been very few cross-compliance fines. There have been numerous ones on MVZs and nitrate vulnerable zones and nitrate leaching and bad practice, because it's easy to pick up. There are few trained people out there, and very, very few in Natural England and the Environment Agency who are trained enough to recognise soil damage. Absolutely. And that is the biggest problem. We've also had the Soil Protection Review, which was a tick box exercise. It didn't involve digging a hole. And we need soil scientists on the ground to do the job. We could incentivise farmers. We actually need to incentivise education to get good soil scientists out there. And I believe really passionately in this, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, so it was great to see that DEFRA, that advice that has just gone out, November 2016, did you see it? 5-year cycles for the farmers, encouraging them to sample all of this. That's such a massive step through, because, doing it and sending it to the labs, they can do it.
Can I just violently agree with both sides?
Right. I think we're violently agreeing, aren't we?
The speaker just now, I'm working with farmers as well. And I totally agree with what Bridget says, and I don't think it would be a problem for the farmers. I've been taking students on farm visits over the last 5 years, and it's really fascinating because without any prompting, all of the farmers we've been to are talking about soil health and soil carbon. Mm-hmm. And, there was one using tiller radish and getting his neighbour's sheep, so that was the example that David talked about with mixed farming sort of by... They're doing all these things, and the main thing that they were complaining about was the regulations on the food safety, mm-hmm. which were sort of massive. There's one particular farm who goes on and on about 200 different chemicals that are measured within an inch of their life and all the rest of it. But I think so long as it's done sensitively and reasonably, most of them, as you say, are doing good practice, and they would welcome it because it catches the ones that show up the others. Mm-hmm.
I'll be really quick, but I just wanted to say I think you're right to say that it's not just farming, and you're talking about those obscene levels of phosphate in gardens and that kind of stuff. And maybe not in the UK, it's not necessarily most relevant, but in a lot of other countries, forestry has lots of large areas of land with large areas of landholders that may or may not follow through on great practices. So I think if you're looking at the 4permil in a more global context, that's a really important thing to look at too. And I know you mentioned biochar and that kind of stuff. In Scandinavia and in northern Canada, they're looking at areas where you can try to make biochar, where you're taking the refuse from the land, from the forestry, burning it for energy for the local community, and then trying to use it as a substance to reinvigorate the land. It's not really conclusive, but they're trying to do it because of the holistic sort of approach to it. So,
yeah. I was just going to respond on the supermarkets question. Yeah, we are working with supermarkets and food processors. We work with one of the famous potato processors, without mentioning any names, and managed to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, I think it was. Okay. We're working with a few other supermarkets, and some of them are really quite proactive in what they're doing. And we have one or two potentially as part of a Horizon 2020 project where we can work with them.
Because my experience is supermarkets are as diverse as well, where there are some that are great and there are some that have different priorities in terms of what they ask farmers for. Yeah.
Sorry. Our get hung up that it has to be 0.1%. It might well be in some soils, but perhaps not in all soils.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was the last word.
Yeah, we all agree.
So I think we've had a really good discussion. Thank you everybody for contributing today. So I'm going to ask the question again that I asked at the beginning. See if anything's changed or not. So could I have a show of hands then, though? Who thinks the 4permil is achievable in the UK? Yes. It's gone down. I think all about the same.
It's the biochar people. Look, the biochar people.
No. A few more for no, and don't know. So less of you on the fence.
And who thinks it's achievable to do better than now?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Less unanimous.
I think this is the right question we should ask.
Excellent. So, thanks for that, Claire. So that is encouraging. So we'd also like to get your insights, please. So there'll be these slips of paper out where you have coffee. If you could fill them in, please. So it's asking, what would be the most effective action to achieve 4permil in UK soils? So please, if you've already contributed, or if you've not, please, can you just jot something down, and we can then capture that. Okay, and then before we break, then before we move on to poster presentations, I've just got one thing to say, and that is a huge thank you to all our speakers, panel members, and panel chair.
All of you as well for contributing to the debate. Thank you. It's the first time we've run this, so we had no idea where it would go.